So we can hear it, because we want to make sure everybody hears the question. Tell us who you are and your question.
My name is Yuri Gama, and I'm from UMass Amherst. I'm a PhD student, and I'm researching Latin American history and urban history in Brazil. My question is related to, there are several ways of understanding our discussions, and we can focus more in a narrative that is related to chronologically or more towards common questions. And I was wondering, what about concepts like sociological concepts or concepts like Global South? I was wondering how you're thinking about this factor. Thank you.
You want to take that one?
Yeah, we had some interesting discussions in our Emma and I in the workshops about Global South and the issues with that term and how it pre-frames, right, the questions that are going to be directed at studying, places like Brazil, Africa, and Asia. And Global City also was one, right? We kind of borrowed the term from sociology. It was useful for us to get the grant because it was a recognizable term. And we could say, right, that our proposal is to, as historians, engage with this emerging field and what we can learn from it or what it can learn from us. But I think, right, historians usually, I think, don't really stick to some of these concepts because maybe one of the good things we do is we often allow our sources to guide us, right, in how we're going to talk about things, and maybe that's a good thing, and that's something we can offer to certain conversations. But right, I mean, these terms are out there, and we should engage with them critically, and we should use them when they're useful, and they can help create dialogue, right, because they can help us maybe reach other fields, right, and other methodological approaches. So I guess I don't have a definite answer.
Yeah, let me just say that this is something that really exercises me a lot. And one of the main, and I didn't mention this as a main reason for pushing forward with this project, but I think it is actually in some ways the most important reason for me personally. Urban studies for a very long time has gone global, back in the 80s, really, or even mid-80s, even early 80s, when they first really started. Many urban theorists were among the first people to talk about globalization, for example, and those kinds of things. And they've used a language that's appropriate to social sciences. They've used a language that they think helps them with understanding changes that have happened recently, and they think are happening recently. And they have gone way ahead of us, and they've created a massive archive of theoretical, sometimes research-based work. And all along the way, have they read one single urban historian? Well, yes, here and there, and occasionally it will show up as one of their vignettes or one of their things that prove their entire, a paragraph in our book will prove their entire theory. Those kinds of things. That gets a little bit under my skin. I mean, I'm not going to try to overstate that case. And yet, at the same time, we've borrowed many of those concepts from that literature wholesale. I think it might be worth almost, and then here I am, so oftentimes these conversations get started, urban historians don't look at the big picture enough. We're always looking down at that, that street corner and that fire hydrant. And we're never going to get our eyes off of that thing. But the reverse is true too, that global urban historians have these gigantic fisheye lenses that they use various different kinds of words, like these various different word processes, instantiations, blah, blah, blah. And it's unclear to me whether it helps us resolve back on the fire hydrant in a remotest sense. And so what I would like to see is us beginning to use the strengths of the Urban History Archive. We have 100 years worth of thousands upon thousands and thousands of secondary works to build upon that authority and all of its complexity and all of its, precisely its sheer messiness. Can we bring that to global history as well in a productive way? So this will be something I'll be certainly thinking about, sort of on the top of my mind. And one of the first conferences I hope we have is to bring in some of these theorists and sit them down with us and say, hey, wait a minute, let me call you on that. Let me call you on that. Let me call you on that. Those kinds of things. Do you want to add to this, Nancy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, your comments are making me remember how important it is that we keep these conversations interdisciplinary, and your question provokes that same question. So for instance, global cities, there is a lot of kind of weird garbage coming out about this sort of high-tech, networks, London, Tokyo, you know who I'm referring to, and then her detractors, so there's that world, and then, there's the formal sort of book that came out, Globalizing Cities, that was coming out of planning circles, actually. And that urban historians would do well to read, actually. There's a lot of interesting material in there. There's a lot of work being done, for instance, by Ananya Roy on informality that urban historians should read. So again, there's a lot of learning that can happen with thinking about these terms critically. Richard Harris is a geographer, but he's written this great book on how we complicate the word suburb and suburbanization, and he's also a contributor. I'm going to do a small plug with Nikhil Rao on that same question for the book we just put out with UPenn Press. I'm looking at Bob, who is a wonderful editor, if you're ever looking for someone. So there's lots of different ways in which I think this interdisciplinary can help us. And going back to your question, Matthew, I think actually global urban history has exactly the formula you need to avoid that problem of floating above and not really understanding places. So Larry Vail, for instance, asks questions about resilience, but he has to do it in specific places in his collection with the Fish Sanya at MIT. Or when you're talking about the intersections, James, between Asian American history and urban history, they have to happen in specific places. Now sometimes you're doing the sort of transnational work that is imaginary in the sense that Salman Rushdie has this wonderful discussion of how he can never go home to his home because it doesn't exist anymore, so it's sort of imagined geographies. But nonetheless, they are concrete places that people are talking about and engaging with. Laura, your work on theory is always happening in specific places. You're talking about Brazilian housing, but you're talking about built form. So again, I don't think that permission is granted to global urban historians to just remain in the world of conceptual or theoretical. Same for petroleumscapes. We can talk about global petroleum, but we can't talk about it petroleumscapes if we're not talking about very specific Chinese cities or very specific mud housing. So again, there's that wonderful connection between this concrete and very tangible existence and then the sort of conceptual framework that helps us to understand.
Thanks. But you're I'm sorry, do you want to say something, Michael?
I just wanted to add, because I think you specifically mentioned sociological vocabulary, right? And I think there's also a certain, I'm not sure whether to say, mismatch between the neighboring disciplines from which urban historians like best to borrow and global historians, and they're not necessarily the same. So maybe there's a caricature of urban history which has become very diverse, but in particular if I think of the urban history of the 1960s and social history and so forth, I think that urban historians still today are much more comfortable borrowing certain sociological vocabulary than a lot of global historians are, to whom terms like social upward mobility or even that kind of stuff are often almost anathema, which is strange, I think, and there's a larger issue at stake, which is that political and intellectual historians have been keener to flock to the urban history label than social historians have, and I think it has an impact on the prospects or what conceptual vocabulary can be a posit for bringing global and urban history together, because well, probably also urban historians react more allergically to certain post-colonial jargon that global historians feel more comfortable with. So So I think that there's also slightly different conceptual vocabularies in the two fields that impact on the conversation sometimes.
And so just very quickly, I think it again has a chronological component as well, because for example, when Mariana and I started reading some of this urban studies material, certainly for me, when I came across the phrase global south, it was totally meaningless to me in an 18th century context, because of course the global south was much more powerful than the global north in many ways, in an imperial sense, in the 18th century. So yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I'll just say something really quick, and we've been talking about the sociological concepts that allow us to make comparisons and whatnot, but when you first asked your question, I was also thinking about simply not like fancy sociological concepts, but simply the words that we use to talk about cities. Words like street or slum, they seem to be very evident, but nevertheless, I think most of the kind of just plain urban vernacular that we use when we're talking about a city, and when we're writing in English especially, all of this, I think, in the eyes of the reader, it is kind of taking us to a certain idea of the city that is North Atlantic, and that is also maybe stuck in the moment of Belle Époque, bourgeois modernity. Maybe that could be wrong. So I think the challenge is even when we're using very simple words that apparently do not elicit this kind of discussion that we're having right now. But I think that's also a challenge. Like, what is the basic kind of commonsensical knowledge that we all think we have when we're talking about a neighborhood, or when we're talking about a boulevard, or when we're talking about a slum or a suburb? So I think that maybe just makes it more complicated, but I think it's also important to say it.